just came in. There we go. All right. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad you're here. You are at Cherry Hill Seminary's program, Coming to the Center. And we are the leading provider of education and practical training in leadership, ministry, and personal growth in pagan and nature-based spiritualities. We're all online. If you have any questions about Cherry Hill, you can always go to cherryhillseminary.org, which I'll put in the chat box, cherryhillseminary.org. And today we're so thrilled to have with us a really key figure in a key movement that has influenced all of us in pagandom, whether we know about it or not. Jo Carson is a pagan priestess, and she has a master's degree from UCLA in film production. And so she has been a professional film producer and camera person on a lot of feature films. You may be familiar with the piece, the documentary she did called Dancing with Gaia, Earth Energy, Sacred Sexuality, and the Return of the Goddess, and some other things too. But today she's here to primarily talk to us about Feraferia, which was started by Fred Adams and his wife Svetlana in the early 60s?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fairly accurate,
and yes, they are both now of blessed memory, but Jo has become the executor of all of Fred's art and papers collection. And I believe Feraferia still meets on your property, right?
Yeah, and in Southern California sometimes as well.
Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you and invite you to share, Jo. We're just excited you're here, and thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Holly. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited to share this material. I've done a deep dive into fairy to prepare the talk, and I've really gotten kind of excited about it. I think this is actually very important material. So that said, I'm going to start my share screen. I have a PowerPoint to share with you now, and then we'll talk afterwards. So let me get there. And there we are. Good. Let's see. Let me just prepare my screen. It's got one more thing I need to do. There we go. Okay. This image is the magic maiden. It's a symbol of Feraferia, and the name Feraferia means celebrate wildness. In the spring of 1956, a California artist named Fred Adams had a vision of the goddess as the source and center of life, and he spent the rest of his days celebrating the goddess and writing and making art and ritual around the sacred feminine. I got to know Fred and his life partner Svetlana in 1970. I joined their group a little later. At one point, I asked Fred to do a drawing of what he saw when he had his vision, and this is part of what he drew. I was a UCLA film student at the time, and I offered to make a film of Feraferia, doing their seasonal rites, along with a time lapse of the seasons changing over a year's time. When I made the film, I called it A Dance for the Goddess, and in its somewhat ancient 1970s technology, it's available on YouTube. And this is the famous Joe Wilson, for those of you who know him. That film is not to be confused with Dancing with Gaia, my much more recent feature-length documentary about earth energy, sacred sexuality, and the goddess. It was also inspired by Fred and Feraferia. Here is Fred, founder of what was initially the Hesperides Fellowship, which then became Feraferia. It is an incorporated church with the goal of spreading ideas of the goddess and visions of a paradisal future. We aim to transform and reactivate the timeless initiatic code of planet Earth. Lady Svetlana of Feraferia, as she called herself, joined Fred in the early 60s and helped to develop the vision. This is their newsletter. They held rites and feasts and traveled to spread ideas of a fairy faith, a way of living that integrated folkways with earth and goddess. They found roots and inspiration in the lore of Celtic countries and of ancient Greece, such as the story of Demeter and Persephone, which is shown here on the cover of the Green Egg magazine. All of the art I'll be showing you is by Fred Adams. This was the first appearance in modern times of an image of the goddess in a major paper, looking quite powerful. Fred wrote an article in it concerning the festival meanings of the vernal equinox. And this is from Fred's 1967 folio, The 9 Royal Passions, illustrating the green earth's journey through the year. The 9 Royal Passions refer to the 8 high points of the year, the solstices, equinoxes, and cross quarters, plus one specific to Feraferia called Repose, which honors a return to Source and Thanksgiving during the Samhain to Yule period of time. At midsummer, as pollination climaxes throughout the land, the goddess and god join in sacred marriage. She announces her pregnancy at fall equinox as they harvest the fruits of the season. They descend into a beautiful underworld chamber and merge in ecstasy. In late autumn, the pregnant goddess sleeps. She awakens at winter solstice as the babe kicks within. The new year will begin with his rebirth. Feraferia celebrates the festivals of the sacred year, as you see here. Fred dances there on the left with Svetlana in the middle. Feraferian groups usually install henges. They're like hinges of the sacred year. Your henge becomes the sacred center or omphalos of your world. The henge can be made of wood or stone. It can either be elaborate like this one or simple with just stones you find in the area. The key thing is that the markers are oriented to the directions and the landforms in the distance. By setting it up this way, you have a circle to call the fairies and elements into when you're going to do your rite or trance, blessings, or dedication. You're now oriented to the seasons, the planets, and the constellations. The central altar becomes a place of power where the gods touch, embrace, and recharge. For this fall equinox rite, we painted some poles and put signs of the planets on top of them. Now let's talk about fairies. Feraferia is a fairy faith in the sense that we seek out fairy spirits and commune with the spirits of nature. Much of this material came from an essay that Fred Adams wrote between 1966 and 75 called The Love Lore of Fairy. There are other source books too, which I will mention as we come to them. Like dry leaves pressed between the pages of an old book, in childhood fables, we find the crumbling remains of a once green race. Their windswept revels still faintly stain the humdrum lines of sober history. Fairy lore is the despised matrilineal treasure to which all people are equal heirs. The idea of fairies is despised because it comes from an earlier, supposedly more ignorant era. According to noted scholar W. Evans Wentz, women were often the primary custodians and transmitters of fairy lore. Women, especially elderly women, held a prominent position in many communities as the keepers of traditional knowledge, including tales of fairies. In an encyclopedia of fairies, Catherine Briggs discusses the concept of the wise woman or cunning woman, often an older female who possessed knowledge of magical and supernatural beings, including fairies. According to Robert Kirk in his 1691 book, A Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, fairy ways reveal the true bond between soil and soul. It was once common for all folks whose ways were integrated with nature. There was a time when beliefs, lifeways, and agriculture formed an integrated whole. This was called a topocosm by Theodore Gaspis in his work Thespis. A topocosm includes all elements, both alive and not alive, in a loving rhythm of celebrations. A question comes, how can visions of fairies help humans to reintegrate with a new form of topocosm? First, we must understand what fairy is. The basic activity that we find the fae engaged in is the charming of nature by singing its song and dancing its seasonal dance. By doing these things ourselves, we find that our souls form a fusion with the landscape. There has been a gradual development in our ideas of fairy. First, there was the primordial observation that the natural forms and forces of nature contain power and potency. Early humans attributed will, passion, and intention to these powers, which we call the landscape, the seascape, and the elements, such as the wind, fire, and storms. Then over time, poets, storytellers, and sorceresses projected their own dreams and designs into those forms and forces. Fire became Ra, Hephaestus, Vulcan, and Bridget as examples. The ideas spread through their communities and became real for the people. Indigenous people often sang through much of the day, every day, as they did their daily activities. I saw this when I traveled in the Himalayan mountains for 3 months in 1971. The farmers and yak herders sing their beliefs about the gods all day. I also saw this in the raw documentary footage from Africa of a fellow filmmaker in the same era. We all have cultural memories of sailors and pirates singing as they swab the decks or raise the sails. So the community created the passages of fairy by chanting them into being as they sang at their work and play every day. The deceased spirits of the community could then use these collectively created passages. The deceased souls would well up into numinous trees, stones, lakes, and springs. Enchanted caves became passageways to the underworld. For the magician, the collective unconscious is identical with the world processes of the elements, or it is, as it is also called, the objective psyche. The experiences of the ancestors play out in each of us through the inner activities of the archetypes in our own lives. They also appear as the sometimes visible, intentional activities of the elves and fays in these same forms and forces of nature that feel so powerful to us. The gods were once thought of as actual places, along with all the life forms resident in them. For example, Poseidon was the seas, fish, and rivers. Artemis was the dark forest, deer, and green meadows. Athena was the high places, such as the temple-encrusted Acropolis and the owl in the treetops. Over time, these gods usually became haughty sun and storm figures, and they favored the pastoral, agrarian warrior castes. However, when one people defeated another, the formerly proud gods of the locals were once more relegated to their aboriginal state of being nature spirits, which are immanent within and not transcendent above the vital elements. They no longer command, but ensoul the processes of nature, as they originally did. In a 1966 lecture on the historical roots of our ecological crisis, Dr. Lynn White Jr. explained the problems that come with separating divinities from the textures of nature. In antiquity, every tree, every spring, every stream, every hill had its own genius loci, its guardian spirit. These spirits were accessible to men, but were very unlike men. Centaurs, fauns, and mermaids show their ambivalence. Before one cut a tree, mined a mountain, or dammed a brook, it was important to placate the spirit in charge of that particular situation and keep it placated. By destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood of indifference to the feelings of natural objects. When Milesian, that is Celtic, invaders overcame the ancient Irish people of the goddess Danu, Their defeated gods, the Tuatha, retired to the sacred mounds and hills, and there rested in paradise. After that, they were enshrined by mortals as the Sidhe, or gentry, or fairy folk. Ireland's Boyne River Valley has several large fairy mounds. This is the most famous, the Bruna Boyne, meaning the big house of the Boyne. Boann was a river goddess. It was believed to be the home of the Dadya and Owengus Oak, who were the gods of the Tuatha De Danann. There are many types of fairy, partly because many generations of transcendent deities have successfully been relegated to the elementary forms and forces of nature. If one is part of a ruling group, one may see one's ancestors as divine, and over time they may merge into a supreme one God, quite above and detached from humanity and the elements. As time passes, our conceptions morph this one God into an it, with no humanly apprehendable shape, which then becomes the white light, which rather omnivorously digests every form and color that has supposedly devolved from it. The emptying of Earth and of her tutelary souls and spirits reduces her to a pile of resources for the fool with a tool to exploit. Humanity's current disbelief in the will and intentions of nature's parts can result in either abstract materialism or abstract mysticism, but with the same sad result, which is environmental destruction. Strip mining destroys the mountains and all their living creatures. If there were spirits before, they are gone now. Clear cutting has the same effect. As Faris Jabbar writes in the New York Times Magazine, the razing of an old growth forest is not just the destruction of magnificent individual trees. It's the collapse of an ancient republic whose interspecies covenant of reciprocation and compromise is essential for the survival of Earth as we know it. The pure water, air, sea, and forest sustain us. Deep inside, we have to realize that wilderness is the ultimate holy context of our life, love, and values on Earth. Time and loving care can sometimes heal the wounds, but the fae spirits may take a very long time to come back. Every pagan tradition respects the life and presence of ancestral nature spirits. Belief in fairies presented a direct challenge to Christian colonialists. The new religion presented an all-male Judeo-Christian God who was supposed to have cast out some proud or rebellious angels from heaven. This story was adapted to the fairies. So the new idea was that the fairies had once been angels of this God, but had been cast out and now lived in an intermediate realm between earth and heaven, or underground. A large number of Evans Wentz's reporters subscribed to this idea for the origin of fairies. However, no one described Queen Maeve or Ogma Sun God or any of the indigenous gods of the people as throwing out the fairies. That was a strictly Christian notion. Preachers of the new religion often demonized the fairy folk, who they said were dangerous. Stories proliferated of fairies taking people away, or exchanging their babies, or of poking out the eye of someone who could actually see them. Of course, telling stories about fairies taking children away would be an easy way to make sure the children would stay in at night. And fairies were a handy scapegoat if someone had a deformed child or a bad crop or sickness in their herds. Some people actually wound up beating or abandoning babies in the belief that it was a fairy child and that the fairies would give their own baby back if they did so. It is hard to know which of the stories about the ambivalent fairy races are actually pre-Christian. The reporters from Wales were fairly uniform in considering the fairies as kindly, while the Irish and Scots often feared their fairies. One thing all agree on is that it is best to respect the fairies, which means to be honest with them, not insult them, and never harm their homes or haunts. The fays recede from us into the remaining wild places, but they maintain their nimble wit and good humor. Grant Stewart reports that fairies are passionately given to festive amusement and jocund hilarity. The fae hold gaiety and solemnity as a single whole. Spiritual leaders think they can enlighten us by exploding what they call primitive demonologies. But the seer of hawthorn, oak, and apple can see nature in its naked state, and for them the fays are still there. Our pagan seers can mirror themselves in Nimue's sacred pools, and thus appear themselves in fairy, as the fays, brightly studded with glowworms and fireflies. It helps sometimes to be naked ourselves in the wilderness. The stag and rhino need no clothes. When naked, we feel the zephyrs of scent-laden spring, or the bubbles of the spring-fed lake throughout our body. The seers of hawthorn, oak, and apple can also be the good grovers of the trackless tanglewood and of the elements themselves. Some people believe the membranes of fairy divide the visible facets of nature from its creative love aspect, with its vast magical sisterhoods of nymphs, dryads, fauns, and fairies. External facets of nature only partially conceal the subtle labors of love performed by advanced beings in between incarnations in linear time. The bodhisattvas of Buddhism seem somewhat similar. While on this side, the glamours of the fairy ring moon dance charm different world orders into harmonious convergence. The fae harbor nature's natural religion, which is imprinted on humanity by the very ecological processes of the world itself. It benefits us to think of the biosphere as being fully conscious throughout, though with different types of consciousness than we're used to. As a whole, it seems to possess a transformative intention and program. Each species is guided to play their part. Humanity is the prime quickener and catalyst of change, and so we must be painstakingly conscientious of our role in service to nature. We need to allow nature to show us the broad guidelines within which we may improvise. Nature's guidelines are most reliably revealed by muse inspiration, as poet Robert Graves describes in his writing. Quiet and timeless moon muse devotion reveals the shimmering shrine of fairy, which remains leaf-locked and always elsewhere to the profane. The despoiler or loveless researcher may well be lured in to be swallowed up altogether and recycled according to the requirements of the mountain mother. As William Blake wrote, the roarings resound of lion and wolf, the loud sea and the deep gulf. These are the guards of my fold. Mused guidelines reveal to poet and magician how to liberate wildness and grow nature into paradise, a more innocent and childlike version of itself. We can see in British fairy traditions by Lewis Spence how parts of the Australian Aboriginal tradition resonate with the core of a once universal fairy faith. Their word, Al-Chiringa, refers to the dreamtime age of humans' first self-knowledge, when all species were one. Composite human, animal, plant creatures were deposited into certain places to form groups of women and men. Their spirits have been reincarnating ever since then. When one dies, they return to the place of original spirit deposit, the Okanakila. Each spirit who belongs to an Aruntarenia answers to a stone or wooden slab with a totem symbol, which is called a chiringa. The Aruntarenia are very similar to the Fae. They await reincarnation in numinous landmarks, certain trees, rocks, or pools. They say that a spirit leaps from there into a passing woman, who then becomes pregnant. Relatives then search for the chiringa to discover the all-important name or clan of the child. In Tibet, there are the dakinis, or skygoers, who appear at twilight and are mystical female beings. In Celtic countries, ghosts are fays to be, and fays are ghosts transformed by initiation after death, and they are practically interchangeable in the minds of the community. It may be more accurate to say that the fae develop from an amalgam of demoted gods, spirits of place or element, and ancestors of ancestors. Evans Wentz's deeply researched 1911 book, The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, also shows parallels between Aruntarenia and Celtic fairies. Both inhabit an invisible world. They are seen by certain seers. This is called second sight in Ireland and Scotland. This faculty for perceiving the departed as glorified beings was once the subject of a special initiatory cult. Apparently, it still is in the Fiji Islands. In nearby Malakula in New Hebrides, there's a similar cult of initiation at death, associated with a powerful female spirit. Megalithic structures are found there too. Their dead are thought to follow specific paths to reach their final homes. In the British Isles, the Fae travel specific roads to feasts at seasonal climaxes. Their paths are best avoided by others at those times, and you would never want to build anything there. I will use several cards from my new Feraferia Tarot, which is in progress, to illustrate this part of my talk. This one shows a green-haired teenager intruding on a group of dryads, which are tree spirits. The symbols at the top reveal relationships between the planets. This one is Venus influenced by the Earth, but being in swords, it is an edgy situation. Now, I have some stories of fairy encounters to tell you about. This report is from Evans Wentz's interview of William Cashin, a well-known keeper of the old Peel Castle on the Isle of Man. On Dalby Mountain, the old Manx people used to put their ears to the earth to hear the sounds of infinity. Sheena Ifenid, which were sounds like murmurs. They thought the sounds came from beings in space, for in their belief, all space is filled with invisible beings. Fairylands are often thought of as islands, such as Avalon, the Isle of Apples. In Australian and Celtic traditions, fairies often appear as thin, shadowy, youthful beings. The Irish she often relate to specific natural features. Their term she for the fairy folk sounds similar to the Japanese term Shinto and means the way of the gods or spirit power. Shinto is the Aboriginal paganism of Japan, and it continues to thrive there now. They venerate kami, which are nature divinities of the land, sky, and waters. Many indigenous people believe the deceased retire into the depths of wilderness, for which they have a certain awe. Often ancestors are thought to merge with tree genii or animal totems, but still retain their volition and individuality. In communities which embrace rapid cultural change, primitive religion fractures into diverse beliefs, including the charming fantasy of fairies with the wings of metamorphic insects which patrol the wilds. Outside the areas of speedy cultural change are areas that tend to retain the oldest types of ancestral spirituality, such as Ireland. W.B. Yeats saw Irish immigrants offer simple sacrifices to the Fae in the slums of London on a fairy feast day. According to Evans Wentz, his maidservant went out to get some peat for the fire and noticed something whizzing through the silent air. It passed through her hair, grazing her ear, and fell at her feet. Stooping in the bright moonlight, she picked up a slender flintstone fairy arrow, as they were called then. Evans Wentz recounts many sightings of fairies in his book. For instance, his friend, a fellow Oxford student, was traveling home one evening with another friend on horseback, and they saw a pair of floating yellow lights ahead. He said, suddenly, each of these lights expanded into the same sort of luminous yellow flame, about 6 feet high by 4 feet broad. In the midst of each flame, we saw a radiant being having human form. Presently, the lights moved toward one another and made contact, whereupon the two beings in them were seen to be walking side by side. The two beings' bodies were formed of pure, dazzling radiance, white like the radiance of the sun and much brighter than the yellow light or aura surrounding them. So dazzling was the radiance, like a halo round their heads, that we could not distinguish the countenances of the beings. We could only distinguish the general shape of their bodies, though their heads were very clearly outlined because of this halo-like radiance, which was the brightest light about them. It seemed to radiate from or rest upon the head of each being. As we traveled on, a house intervened between us and the lights, and we saw no more of them. He went on to say that his companion saw all that he saw, and that formerly he had been a skeptic as to the existence of spirits. And he said, "Now I know that there is a spiritual world." From Mr. J.H. Kelly, past Provincial Grand Master of the Isle of Man District of Oddfellows and a resident of Douglas, we have this account of his experience. 12 to 13 years ago, on a clear moonlit night, about 12 o'clock, I left Laxey and went about 5 miles from Douglas. At Balagon's school, I heard talking and was suddenly conscious of being in the midst of an invisible throng. As this strange feeling came over me, I saw coming up the road, 4 figures as real to look upon as human beings and a medium size, though I am certain they were not human. When these 4, who seemed to be connected with the invisible throng, came out of the Garwick Road into the main road, I passed into a byroad leading down to a very peaceful glen called Garwick Glen, and I still had the same feeling that the invisible beings were there with me, and this continued for a mile. There was no fear or emotion or excitement, but perfect calm on my part. I followed the byroad, and when I began to mount a hill, there was a sudden and strange quietness, and a sense of isolation came over me, as though the joy and peace of my life had departed with the invisible throng. From different personal experiences like this one, I am firmly of the opinion and belief that the fairies exist. One cannot say that they are wholly physical or entirely spiritual, but the impression left on my mind is that they are an absolutely real order of beings, but not human. The Tylwyth Teg are the fairies of Wales. Miss Mary Owen, 103 years of age when Evans Wentz interviewed her on her farm, gives this account. There were many of the Tylwyth Teg on the Llywydiarth mountain above here and round the Llywydiarth lake where they used to dance, and whenever the prices at the Llangefni market were to be high, they would chatter very much at night. They appeared only after dark, and all the good they ever did was singing and dancing. Anne Jones, whom I know very well, used to often see the Tylwyth Teg dancing and singing, but if she went up to them, they would disappear. She told me they are an invisible people and very small. Many others besides Anne Jones have seen the Tylwyth Teg in these mountains and have heard their music and song. The ordinary opinion was that the Tylwyth Teg are a race of spirits. I believe in them as an invisible race of good little people. Talented and articulate astral travelers inform us that as humanity has radically disconnected from nature, the various forms of fairy life have responded conversely. They are consolidating a wave of love, freedom, joy, and creativity in accord with the great watchers of the galaxy. They are preparing to break through the membranes of psychic twilight and parlay once more with humans in linear time. For followers of astrology, this will quicken the forces of the incoming age of Aquarius. As humans increasingly invent mechanisms that are supposed to reduce labor and increase leisure, we find the inverse to be the result. Typewriters increase the requirements for more secretaries and more paper. Computers create more computer jobs and use even more paper, and so on. The soot just keeps increasing. While for the Fae, as they eschew machines, their delight in the splendors of dalliance multiply. As elves courteously submit to nature, they seem ever more humane. The good people never suppress the urge to dance. The Fae seem to be the merry emissaries of the tree. They may descend from a fruit orchard culture that traveled the earth promoting a tree cultivation lifestyle, as W.B. Stevens argues in The Recovery of Culture, with new supporting evidence from J.P. Cohane. They may have come from Java, as Stevens thinks, during the Mesolithic and Neolithic era. Their influence was largely erased by the savagery of the corn cattle battle peoples, especially during the third millennium BCE. Human enclaves were brutalized by the ice ages in the north, and the warring nation states of today still suffer from a mass psychosis of ice age logic. If so, our visions of the Fae may be poetically true to some early prototype of peaceful, matricentric tree peoples from the more clement southerly regions of the globe. Between incarnations, these people go right on trying to help plants and trees grow earth into paradise. into Orchard Island Earth. Fred Adams ventured a fantasy speculation of a flying island that may have arrived and left long ago, spreading the fairy faith, megalith building, and goddess worship. Fred theorized that islands such as Java, Malakuva, Dilmun, Crete, Malta, and Britain, being reasonably secure from marauders, would serve as secondary and tertiary staging centers for the paradisal maturation of Earth into an arboricultural paradise. Ancient Crete was based on the olive tree and the vine tree. Permaculture teaches the value of the tree in what they call permanent agriculture, which aims to be a way to live more lightly on the land with less toil. In their art, the people of ancient Crete appeared fairy-like in build and demeanor. Egypt showed similar delicate human forms. According to Arnold Toynbee, the Minoan peace was the longest in recorded history. This is Fred Adams holding a Feraferian Vitalis symbol next to the Prince of Lilies fresco created around 1550 BCE in Crete. The Fae are the custodians and celebrants of the green world and part of the spiritual portion of the biosphere. They are the archetype of a paradisal fusion of humanity and nature through nature-blending art, primarily in response to the flowering fruit tree. As humans became more technical-minded and nature-severed, the thought of fays became their shadow projection, becoming ever more feared, and then finally relegated to kindergarten stories. The visionary possibility of humane, tender-minded, pan-erotic cooperation with wilderness was totally repressed. Instead of repression, we could have a pagan year of rapturous celebration, wherein subsistence activities such as food growing, tending, and harvesting become sung and shared as sacrament rather than our current ecologically schizophrenic drudgery. In the late 1800s, the Native American ghost dance cult arose as a desperate response to the unstemmable tide of European invaders. Their ecstatic round dances aimed to swirl all the living and dead into a paradisal communion. One of their leaders, Wewoka, spoke against any maiming of Mother Earth, including farming, for fear she would not accept her children back in death for rejuvenation and rebirth. This contrasts very starkly with the view of John Muir's father, who insisted that if one didn't assiduously apply the axe to forest trees, then he would be aiding and abetting the devil himself, who, he feared, lived in those sylvan depths. The terms fairy and fae are words of power and are loaded with important meanings. Many say fae is from the Latin fatum, meaning the fates, and fatae, the goddesses of fate. Also, fatui means the nymphs. The medieval Latin word fatare means to enchant and may have modulated into fairy. Only in a late corruption has fairy come to mean an individual fae, according to Lewis Spence's The Fairy Traditions in Britain. A related word is fera, meaning wild, as in feral, undomesticated or unbroken. Feralis meant belonging to the dead, and hence referred to ancestors. Feral also meant religious rites and games in honor of the dead, performed on February 21st, the last day of parentalia, in honor of parents or ancestors. Feria means a festival, a fair or holiday. The Hellenic word pharaoh meant to bear, as in to bear in the harvest, and was also a goddess called Ferea. This picture shows Agroterra Carpophoros, the goddess who brings in the harvest. Ferusa was the name of a nereid or sea nymph, with her name meaning the bringer. The Feris were a type of beasts who were similar to centaurs and lived on the remote sides of Mount Pelion. The Feraferia was a festival celebrated until the late 1800s in north-central Greece. A child who wore only grass, leaves, and flowers and was accompanied by her peers processed about the village of Larissa, singing for rain. The ancient form of Feraferia would have been a procession round, according to J.C. Lawson's Modern Greek Folklore and Ancient Greek Religion. The Fae were considered the spiritual custodians of ancient seasonal rites, which were ignored at one's peril. The fairy procession was called a raid, and it's a very common theme in folklore, fantasy, and the movies even now. The end of the Lord of the Rings movie comes to mind, when the Fae folk rode their ships bound for the magical islands where death had no power. The name Ferafata was a variant of Persephone, meaning bearer of light. We can interpret this as a belief that she brought the light of guidance to the recently deceased soul when they arrived at her underworld domain. Ferafata includes the sounds indicating both fairy and fata, or fate. According to the early Greek poet Hesiod, the first proto-historical golden race lived in harmony with nature and never toiled for food, which overflowed from the Lady of Wild Things. After very long lives, they transmuted into daemons, or holy spirits, who would remain on earth as guardians of historical mortals, even to this day. These beings sound similar to the fruit orchard culture bearers of H.B. Stevens. Fred Adams had all this in mind when he came up with the new name, Feraferia, in 1967, to emphasize the idea of celebrating wildness and also honoring the ancestors and the Fae. Now we must consider, are the Fae objectively real? They seem to shift in and out of visibility depending on the attitudes of people who may be open to seeing them. Research from the Institute for Noetic Sciences shows that human intention can affect the behavior of photons as they shift between waveform and particle form. Perhaps it is the same with the Fae, and human intention sometimes allows us to see them. They may well live in a slightly different dimension than we do. Fred believed that as Earth proceeds with her spiritual evolution, the quality of space and time will change and become more intentional. It will become more like a feeling-toned field, wherein erotic sensation and lyrical mood will actually live at large in the surround, like the music of the spheres or the invisible silver bells of fairy. He speculated further that as more Fae souls on both sides of the death transition evolve into constant and intensive interchange with the star sisterhood, Atlantis and her paradisal environs will rise again, midst consternation and joy, like the blessed catastrophe of Wicca. Somewhat more realistically, we may envision that Earth will become a paradise once more, and more people will experience the Faes as real. You may ask, have I experienced the Fae? And my answer is yes, in different ways. In April 2021, I saw a swirling energy form in the air for several minutes, just above the central stone in a stone circle at Faywood in New Mexico. It was about 1.5 feet tall. I was doing a ritual there with some friends at twilight. Then the other people commented on seeing it too before I had said anything about it. This made me certain that what I had seen was real. A few years earlier, I went with my family to Ponape, an island country that is literally in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, midway between Hawaii, Japan, and Australia. The people there have a great reverence for nature, especially in the forms of trees and waterfalls. We were taken to a waterfall where a female spirit was supposed to live. They said that if she liked us, we would get wet, and we did. Her presence was joyous. I photographed her rainbow body, and we all felt high, exhilarated, and kind of giddy. The waterfall is well known to locals who venerate it as sacred. They in turn respected us for sensing and honoring the female spirit of the place, and they decided as a direct result to not charge us the usual tourist fee for hiking the trail to see her. Today, in the world of fast food and dollar stores, most of us are totally divorced from the origins of our food, despite knowing that we are what we eat. Foraging is knowing your local area and its plants well enough that you can safely and sustainably gather some of the native plants and prepare them as food. Can we be like the Fae and do this as celebration? When we consider taking up singing and dancing as integral parts of wildcrafting or foraging, we look at something new to most of us, but it is still deeply rooted in our history. Harvesting and eating local plant foods connects us more securely with the land, specifically the land around where you live. It moves your soul and body to be healthy and more connected with the wild realms of the Fae. As we survey the activities of the Fae, we see their singing, dancing, and revels, their seasonal celebrations, processions, and protection of wild places. And we see the assistance they provide to harmonious souls as they help to move the planet toward paradise. We have moved our idea of their appearance from the limited idea of insect-winged miniatures to the many shapes and hues of the ancestors and the interdimensional beings, which have accrued as different former high god forms have retaken up their residence in nature's forms and forces. The Fae go by many names as they have grown with us over the millennia. We hear of them as hobgoblins, nymphs, foleti, duendes, rusalki, villas, menihunis, morioris, devas, kelpies, kilwis, kokokis, kachinas, alaks, senins, pios, and dryads. Plus gnomes, undines, salamanders, sylphs, pixies, will-o'-the-wisps, tilwitheg, and she. This is to name but a few of the antic defenders of the wild realm. On the night side of nature, the forest fools are coming back. Between the far eastern islands of Japan and the far western islands of Britain, fairy souls still ring the world with astral dance. The Fays await that magic twilight hour when their toes will once more twinkle on Earth's surface, in full view of enchantress and enchanter. Perhaps some have already returned. No matter how loud the clang of steel in the bruised and smoggy air, if you put your ear to the ground, you may detect the faint rustle of the secret commonwealth patiently reknitting the gigantic web of rootways in our subsoil for some new and mighty revelation of fairy to open our souls. I hope we can all become more open to sensing the appearance of the Fae in our lives as we wander in the tanglewoods, singing and dancing and celebrating the sacred rites of the seasonal year. Here are some of us dancing at the feast of the first harvest called Lammas at Coria and Aurelia, my home temple. This is one of our Feraferian altars. In 2017, we celebrated the 50th year anniversary of our incorporation as a legal nonprofit at Rivendell in Southern California. We danced under the full moon with the Fae. This is our prayer to Kori, heart of the earth. The last line is, the dance of your green pulse unfolds all bodies and all blessings from earth's fragrant form. Thank you. That concludes the visual part of my presentation. And here is my bibliography for those of you who might be interested. I'll just leave it up there for a moment. And if you have further questions, we can get to those at this time. I think I can stop my share now.
Bravo, and thank you. That was beautiful. I feel so inspired. I did have some questions for you, Jo, and if anybody else does, please put them in the chat box. Keep yourself on mute, and we'll call them. We'll pose the questions to Jo as we can. But for now, I'm curious about what was Fred doing before he had his vision of the goddess. What led up to that?
Well, he had been reading, well, let's go back a ways. Even when he was a child, he lived on the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, which are some fairly large mountains in Southern California. And he was close enough that they were kind of his backyard. So he was really used to going off into the wilderness with his friends. And he envisioned that as being like kind of a perfect lifestyle. He loved the idea that they could go off and just fool around in the wilderness. And so that was just basic. And he like formed a secret club of like himself and some of his friends, and they would go there and have, you know, so these ideas of having a kind of a way of getting away and having secrecy and, you know, celebrating wildness, it was kind of integral to his growing up. And he like had several, you know, he got several degrees, and he studied a lot of things. He was just very open to ideas from around the world. He was reading Margaret Murray and all the books about the early, witches, in the 40s. He was born, I think, in 28. And then in the early 50s, and he was an artist. He had already been developing himself as a graphic artist for a long time. And he got a degree in filmmaking from USC. So he has that similar background to me in that regard. But in the early 50s, he had been reading, I think, a lot of books and making a lot of art already that about when you look at the art, it looks very goddess inspired, but he hadn't really had that vision yet. So that kind of built up. And then when the vision came, he was literally walking across the campus at what is now Cal State University, Los Angeles. And I think he was doing some graduate studies there. And he had this vision. So he never knew like what caused it at that particular moment in time and space. No one ever really knows. It kind of blew him away. And then it was very visible, but not visceral. It was like in his body. The experience wasn't just in his mind, like some psychedelic thing coming out of his head. It was throughout his body. And he described that. But in some ways, these things are always beyond words too,
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you were already part of a group before you became part of Feraferia. How did you get together?
So I guess you heard about astrology when I went to some of the love-ins and be-ins, right, in the late 60s. And, a friend had said, oh, you should read this book. And they gave me one of Aleister Crowley's books, Magic and Theory and Practice. Well, talk about a weird place to start. I mean, because I didn't know anything, right? And it's kind of like, I didn't know the terminology. I didn't know what he was talking about. It was way over my head. But it gave me an idea that there was something interesting there. And it was my first year at UCLA. I saw literally a sign on the telephone pole for what I joined with the Order of the Temple of Astarte, ceremonial magic group. So, that fit right in with and I learned a lot more about ceremonial magic. And the head of that group, Carol Polk Runyon, was very good friends with Fred Adams. And he said, I think you should meet Fred Adams. We should go there and you should meet him because you're going to like him. And he was, of course, 100% right about that. And I stayed with the OTA. I'm still a member, but I was very taken with, Feraferia. When I went over there and I met friend Svetlana for the first time, it was, it was marvelous. There, the floors, walls, and ceilings were covered with goddess imagery and paintings and stuff. And, it was just, I'd never seen an environment like that before. And then there's Svetlana and her diaphanous gowns and, her Russian accent. And, it was fairly magical going in there and meeting them.
Well, tell us a little bit more about your film work. And I want to come back to the Fae in a minute, but
okay,
I'm curious. What did you do? You got out
when
of
I went to UCLA, I made a lot of student films, and I thought I was this great filmmaker. And then I couldn't, get a job making film for anybody, so I went to work in the mailroom at Universal Studios. Talk about a come down. And I was stuck there for about a year and a half, getting very depressed. And and then Hans Holzer started hiring me on weekends to shoot segments for a film that he wanted to put together called Hans Holzer's World of Witchcraft. And now it's a big mystery to me whether this film ever got completed. We shot for about a year, going out like on different weekends and shooting all these wonderful groups that were existing in Southern California. And they were all friends with each other. At that time, we're talking mid to late 70s. The groups all hung out together. Everybody was going around and getting initiations in everybody else's groups. There was a lot of friendship and not too much rivalry between the groups. That's when I pointed out, for instance, the image from my film, A Dance for the Goddess, and Joe Wilson was in it. A number of you will have heard of Joe Wilson. He founded several different groups, and 1734, and I forget what else. But anyway, he was in there, and it was an interesting time, and I met so many fascinating people in the process. And then he lost his funding because it was all based on German tax, credits for people to, find a way to hide their money. So that's why I said, I don't know if the film ever got finished. We shot a lot of footage and he got it. I have heard rumors from people that they've seen bits of it, but I never saw the finished film, which I was sorry about. Nonetheless, I have some amazing, amazing photos because my sister, who was a photographer, did the still photography on those shoots, and they're a great document of the era, but I don't have any of the film, of course. And then I went on to work, I should say, I went on to work in the film industry for many years as a camera person, working on Nightmare Before Christmas and James and the Giant Peach and The Matrix and Star Wars and Indiana Jones and, you know, just Star Trek and lots of movies.
You're such a link with our history. That's one of the reasons I was excited about having you here. Yeah, I want to make sure that everybody who's here understands that. I mean, I only knew of Feraferia through Drawing Down the Moon, Margot Adler's book. So hearing you talk about it, it strikes me that a lot of pagans have difficulty articulating their theology. And of course, I'm using a word that for some people is loaded because it comes out of primarily Christian circles, but it's the term for what we do, you know, and that's something that we're really challenged with as students at Cherry Hill to, you know, think about, what does theology mean for us? What do we believe? And then a lot of pagans say, well, it doesn't matter what I believe, I practice. But why do you practice the way you do? And you've gone into such detail in your presentation today about the basis for, I take it, Feraferian practices. Am I right?
Yes, that's certainly true. Yeah.
I loved the line where you said and I've forgotten the lead up to it, but all space is filled with invisible beings. And to me, that conjures up everything from magical concepts to quantum physics. That there's more space than there is not space. And it's hard to say what's there. I wonder if you'd like to say any more about that.
Right. That was a quote from one of Evans Wentz's people that he interviewed. So that was a statement that was said probably in the very early 1900s, because he was interviewing people, I think, I'm not sure how long, but he published the book in 1911. So before then, when he was doing his research. And it's interesting, you know, that people have been kind of looking through, you know, the membranes of physical reality and seeing things beyond that for a very, very long time. I think that what you can say about how Feraferia accords our practice with our theology is that the hinge, I called it not in jest, a hinge. It's a hinge. It's a place where everything hinges together. And within that space, which we connect it very tightly with the landforms around us and the sacred places that we physically go to, and, you know, make exchanges with little objects, you know, in the distant places where there's a sacred hill or a mountain or a stream or waterfall, and then you bring those things back to your own, you know, hinge or circle. It's like, and then within that, you do your trance work and you go back and revisit those places. And then within the space of your trance, you open yourself to the presence of those invisible beings that may be there for you. And, or maybe you do that while you're there, and then, you know, you reconnect with them when you're back at your home hinge. And that's a practice that I found pretty delightful because it gives you an excuse to go places that you never would normally go. It's like you can look at a map and say, okay, let's find a hinge or a sacred place or something on the northeast ray, right? Let's see what we can find. And so we look at the map, you know, that we see have our circle in the middle of it, right? And then we go off on our map and look, okay, well, here's a place where there's some open space, you know, let's check it out. And we literally, this has happened, you know, we go there. I'm not making this up. We went to this open space that's directly northeast of us, and there happened to be a stone circle there. And it was like, how did that happen? You know, we didn't know anything about there being a stone circle there or anybody putting anything together. And we were kind of taken away by that, you know. And, you know, and other times, you know, we'll go off to a place, and it seems like there's almost always, if you're looking for it, you can find something that has a spiritual quality. And so I highly recommend that practice, you know, like literally, you know, get out your map and put your own, if you haven't made a hinge or some kind of a place within your own land around your place, or even inside if you have to, just call that your center, and then get out your map and, you know, what's north, what's south, you know, you could figure out places to go and then see if you can find some sacred places or make sacred places, because you can do that. You can actually, go to a place and say, this feels like it might be receptive to being that kind of a special place. And to be honest, I think every place is sacred. Sometimes you have a hard time seeing it if it's covered over with cement, but if you can find a place that isn't covered over, you can find something sacred there.
Yes. So you have a message to those of us who are concerned about the environment, right?
Yeah. Where do I begin on that one?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's this whole re-enchanting thing. How do
Yes.
you get people who are thinking in a secular way to open up to enchantment?
Yes. Yeah, the ways that we enchant the world and ourselves, and it's an interactive process. And I think that singing, which the idea of chanting is very much singing, especially rhythmic singing, where you include things that sort of rhyme with each other, because then you bring in like the ability to remember something without having to look at words on a paper. It's easier that way. And you, we talked about, that the people would sing and chant these things into being that weren't there before. And where do they exist? In the minds of the people, but it goes beyond your physical mind. You create something by singing it into being.
That's beautiful. I was very intrigued by your comments about ancestors as Fae. I wonder if you could say a little more about that and how we recognize our ancestors in the Fae world.
There's a lot of levels. My dear friend Carradwin, who is here, I can see her in the room, regularly has an event at Samhain time of year where we travel to the Isle of Apples. And there are other people here in this room, I bet, who have had a similar type of trance journey. But we do a trance where, in trance, spirit mind, we go to this isle, take a boat to get there, and waiting for us there are in fact our ancestors, and we greet them and we talk with them and we hang out with them, all in this trance level of reality. And it can be extremely moving, and I've had some profound experiences as we've done this through the years, because she very kindly has been offering this for many years. And each time that I go, it's different. I'll connect with some other person in a different way than I had before. And I learn things in the process. And sometimes they've been able to settle old questions that kind of felt like they needed to be settled between myself and the people who've gone before me. And that's, one way that, that I personally experienced that. A lot is known about people in very ancient times would bury their dead. We're looking to Çatalhöyük, one of the very earliest of the cities that ever existed in, let's say, the Middle East, Eastern Turkey. And the people would bury their beloved dead underneath the floor of their house. And then they wouldn't be far away. One would think that it would be very easy to contact them because they're so close. At least the remains of their bodies are close. And so certainly you would tend to think about them. There's so many ways in which we as a larger culture, with the keeping of relics of saints. I mean, I believe this is true, you couldn't found an abbey or a monastery or a big cathedral without having a relic, like literally a bone of some saint, because that would be the thing that would give it its sacred quality. And, because of the presence of that relic, then people could more easily connect to that saint. And so I think that there's just so many ways that people can connect to the ancestors and the people that they feel are blessed, from the past. And I want to just say, and I have mixed feelings about it, there is a practice sometimes with using skulls, and apparently in the past, hopefully it stays in the past, this is just my point of view, the skull would be retained of a person who died and then decorated, and people would honor it and worship it, and it would be understood to be oracular, like it would speak to them. So, I believe there is some of that still going on in the world today, but it's a practice that I'm quite distant from. I think it's interesting, but yeah, it's odd.
Well, you and I were talking earlier, and I said that, we had Graham Harvey here back in the winter to talk about animism, or gosh, maybe it was the fall. Anyway, to talk about animism. And that often seems, it's almost like what you're describing is sort of intermediate between that raw animism, that everything is alive, and the more spirits with personality. And Feraferia seems to kind of move fluidly among those realms.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm not sure what more I have to say about that. I think you're right about that, but it's yeah, it's true. I think there's so much to be said for just literally getting outside and, plunking oneself down outdoors in a natural place and shutting up and being quiet and, waiting to see, if there's something that's going to come to a person. You kind of have to start with being able to feel your own body, like proprioception, feeling yourself being inside of your own body, because you can't, I believe, you really can't connect with other things unless you can at least first connect with your own self. So, connect with yourself and then just wait. And, I believe that if you wait quietly, respectfully, that things will appear to you that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see if you were in a big rush in the city. And that's one of the best ways to connect with wild nature.
Nicole asks, what inspired the shape of the top part of the typical Feraferian hinge staff?
The shape of the top part. Is she talking about the Phytala, which I don't think I can show you? Let's see. That's a Phytala for what it's worth. I think that's what she's talking about. So this is supposed to be a tree with like a flowering fruit tree with like a wreath on it, and then leaves, and the leaves also sort of represent the moon. There's roots at the bottom of it and leaves at the top, and it's like a shape like so. So it's the tree. Yeah. The tree and the fruit tree and the sun and the moon. The round part is also the sun.
Okay, so trees really are a key image then.
Yeah.
Looking at all your artwork, especially the tarot deck that you're working on, you may know that I am Kemetic and have studied quite a bit in Egyptology and hieroglyphs. And if you look at anything the Egyptians ever made, it's crammed full of symbols that you may or may not see right away. And your tarot deck reminded me of that. Everywhere you look, you might think it's flowers, but it's little symbols. Everything in the whole image was symbolic. And I take it that's intentional, right?
Yes. And as you get closer and closer, like, looking at every little square centimeter of Fred's art, it's loaded with little faces and just all kinds of creatures. I mean, it's sort of like animistic, as you say, it's kind of fun to look at his stuff very close up. I mean, even the tarot cards, because they're physically rather small, they're tarot cards, they're not big paintings. So,
yeah.
I mean, people won't really see those unless they look at them with a microscope or something, but they're kind of cool. I mean, I've got this copy of the deck right here, which I hadn't really planned on showing, but it does exist as a physical deck. In a prototype. It's just, I had one of those online card places printed up. I'm very excited about it. But they're small, like I say, the images. And I'm kind of, I'm trying to get my mind wrapped around presenting it to some publisher, which I haven't done yet.
Yeah, I know people here are going to want to know when they and how they can access it. So it sounds like that's still in progress.
Yes.
Yeah. What if somebody's interested in Feraferia? Are there other groups in other countries, parts of the country?
Okay. So we've got the we've got feraferia.org, which is, like our website. And And I had the idea that we'd have all this interactive stuff, where people could form little subgroups in it. It's still pretty clunky, and we need to really update the website. There's a ton of articles on it, like 160 or so. But not, you can't really form active little subgroups in it yet. We're trying to cross our fingers on that one. Then we have a Facebook page, Feraferia on Facebook, and then we have Friends of Feraferia, which if you friend me, I can put you in, the Friends of Feraferia. And there's we do a lot of announcements, and, we kind of keep track of the sacred months of the year, which are lunar, on there, which each has its own little initiation that goes with it. I'll get to that in a second. That's interesting. And what else? There's something else. Hold on.
It's feraferia.org, right?
Yes. Feraferia on Facebook, Friends of Feraferia. Oh, and then if you want to reach me, feraferia@icloud.com. That's an email address. So, I'm happy to chat with people. We've got, it's like our group is it's like what grassroots, I think, is a word you can use to describe it. We're not real top down. We try to inspire people to form their own little Feraferian groups and affiliates and subgroups, rather than have an organization where we're sort of in charge of, like saying, oh, you must do X, Y, and Z, we're kind of not really into that. But at the same time, I would like to grow Feraferia just because I believe very much in our goals, I said at the beginning, and I wanted to kind of maybe address this a little bit. In our mission statement, there's a thing about the timeless initiatic code of planet Earth. And I know that that's a rather enigmatic phrase. So I thought I would explain it because I think it's very cool. So the idea is that the high points of the seasonal year, the solstices and the equinoxes, and the cross quarters, each of them contain within their essence, because of what's actually going on in the ecology, as the world turns around, there's things that happen, and that there's an initiation that humans can experience that allows them to really experience that in its most profound aspect. So like we have at spring birth, at summer sex, at the fall death, at midwinter, it's kind of the search for God or contacting the gods or merging with the gods. So those are the huge, magnificent, quaternity of events. But at springtime, so Beltane, it's like we have a feast which literally celebrates flirtation. That's like a human thing that's very important for people, right? You have to flirt. It feels good. Yeah. So we have a kind of a festival that celebrates flirtation. And at Lammas, between summer solstice and fall equinox, it's the honeymoon. So there's, the development of sexuality right there. And at Samhain, we are trafficking with the dead. We're communicating with the dead. That's what Samhain is about, right? So each of these has its important initiatory process. And for Bridget, right, between February 2nd, at that time, we are encouraging the plants to grow. We're encouraging the goddess to come up from the underworld. And so the initiatory festival that goes with that is very much about actively, proactively bringing that birth forward. And so we have one other, because Feraferia has one other festival, which is not so common elsewhere, which is called Repose. And it is between Samhain and midwinter, where we're celebrating compost and hibernation and going within. So we're not fully all the way yet to midwinter, where we're in contact with the depths and the heights, but we're just in that process of going within and at the same time giving Thanksgiving. So yeah, we view those as being initiations.
Huh. Okay, thank you. I want to ask, is everybody able to see the chat box? Do you have other questions? Okay.
A few people have said a few nice things. Good.
Oh, apparently I'm the one that's not seeing it. Okay, that's fine. All right, so if I've missed a question, somebody wave me down, but otherwise it's almost 4:30, so I'm going to start winding us down. While you were talking, I thought, oh, the singing. We are doing a student intensive this summer in July at Mystic South Conference in Atlanta. And there's a credit, 4-credit graduate aspect for those students who sign up for that, but it's open to anybody. The sessions will be in the mornings so that you've got all afternoon and evening and nighttime for the rest of the conference. And it's not performance, it's about singing and sharing our songs and our ways of making music. So just want to mention that to everybody. Another thing that is coming up in June is a forest bathing course, which seems to me to be very related to all of this. It's only 4 weeks, and there will actually be some live meetings where I think you're going to be walking around in the woods if you're able to access those with linked online with the teacher. So that'll be pretty neat. That's one of our Insights series. So it's only during the month of June. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank Jo Carson. I know everybody here is glad to have been able to hear your wisdom. And I hope that you'll come visit us on cherryhillseminary.org. And with that, farewell.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jo.
Okay.